Arthur Lovejoy was a historian working about 100 years ago, and he was interested in the history of ideas. His time horizon was thousands of years. One of the trends he observed going back to antiquity was what he called the principle of plenitude. So he saw this in the ancient Greeks, in medieval times, and up into the modern era. The principle of plenitude was what he called it, and it was this idea that the world should be as full as possible. God should create the world in a way that's as full as possible. There should be no gaps. A couple of examples. One, there shouldn't be any vacuums in nature. So if you go up into outer space, there shouldn't be just nothing between the stars. There should be something there, some material. Another example is all those stars up in the sky. You go out at night, you see all the stars. What are they doing there? There should be civilizations around those stars as well, just like here. So the universe should be as full as possible. Plenitude thinking. This is what Lovejoy identified. He wrote about it in this classic book, The Great Chain of Being, Arthur Lovejoy. The principle of plenitude has had many interesting implications in origins thinking, and as a religious idea that has driven origins thinking and has mandated the theory of evolution. And that's what this video is about. In the 18th century, there was a growing interest in the question of how the cosmos evolved, and in particular, the solar system. How did the solar system evolve? Isaac Newton in his New Physics had described the operation of the solar system, but not the origin of the solar system. How did it evolve? And one of the striking patterns of the solar system is that it's in a plane. And so I'll use this plate as an example here. So imagine the sun in the center of this plane and the planets going around the sun in this plane, this disk. Why doesn't one of the planets go over the top and underneath, or at a 45-degree angle, or whatever? Why are they in the same plane? In fact, we have a name for this plane. It's called the ecliptic. So you have the sun and the planets in the same plane. Now, they're not in exactly the same plane, actually. There's a few degrees of variation, and this was well known at the time, 5, 6, 7 degrees of variation between the angles of the orbits of the planets. So they're practically in the same plane, approximately in the same plane. It's noticeable. If you go out at night and look in the sky and see multiple planets, you will see they are in the same arc there. Not exactly, though. So this played into the thinking of, well, what's going on here? How did the solar system evolve? And the principle of plenitude, or plenitude thinking, was influential here. I'll go to Immanuel Kant as an example here. There were 4 major cosmologists or thinkers who worked on this problem and published and were influential describing the evolution of the solar system. I'll start with Immanuel Kant. He was one of the greatest philosophers in the modern age, and he had a pamphlet or a booklet that he published about mid-century, 1750s, on the origin of the cosmos. A very ambitious theory that he set forth. It was much more than just the solar system, but I'm going to be talking about the solar system part of it here. Now, Kant made 2 important points about this pattern of the solar system, the ecliptic. And it's not just the ecliptic, by the way. There's other patterns as well, such as the spin of the planets. They spin in the same direction. They travel around the sun in the same direction. So it's not just the plane of the orbit of the planets, but other aspects too. The direction of travel on the spin and so forth, and the moons, the direction of the moons as they rotate around the planets. All these patterns that are similar throughout the solar system. Why don't we see more variations? Kant made the point that if God had created the solar system directly without using natural laws, but unmediated, the finger of God, the divine finger, made the solar system, you wouldn't see this. You would see all kinds of deviations. And you can see a parallel with plenitude thinking here. Plenitude, remember the idea that creation, nature should be as full as possible. Here we have an example where it's not full. The space is not being used. Let me read you a quote from Kant on this. Thus, God's choice would not have the slightest motive for tying them, the planets, to one single arrangement, but would reveal itself with a greater freedom in all sorts of deviations and differences. So if God had done it, if God had created the solar system directly, you would see all kinds of deviations and differences. You wouldn't see a pattern like this. You wouldn't see the planets in this plane because there's no reason for it. You can kind of sense an echo of the principle of sufficient reason here. Remember, we looked at the PSR last time in the Greater God video. Principle of sufficient reason. God doesn't do anything without sufficient reason. There's no arbitrary or capriciousness to nature or creation. And that's what it looks like with the solar system. There are these patterns that are not necessary. They're not needed. And so it must have come about by an evolution, not by God's direct hand, not by God's intent or design. That's the proof here. It's a religious idea mandating a naturalistic origins of the solar system. Now, I said Kant made a couple of points. Kant's second point was that, well, maybe there's a reason actually for the planets to be in the same plane. Maybe someday that will be discovered. So Kant forestalled that with the second point, which was if there is a reason for the planets to be in the same plane, then they would be in exactly the same plane. Why do we have 3, 4, 5 degrees of deviations where they're not quite in the same plane? That doesn't seem right either. So here we're back to a kind of Aristotelianism where the superlunar region up above the cosmos is perfect. Things have to be perfect up there. And you wouldn't have these, planets in orbital inclination planes that are slightly different, a few degrees off. They would be perfectly aligned for Kant. So 2 points. This pattern that we see does not exhibit plenitude. It's not using the space available up there. And so God would not have done it that way. It must have evolved. And if there is a reason for them to be in the same plane, they'd be in exactly the same plane. So again, God didn't do it this way. It must have evolved one way or another. It was a very powerful argument that Kant was making. Now, Kant wasn't the first one to make this argument. As I mentioned, there was 3 other thinkers in the 18th century that put forward this argument forcefully. The first one was Daniel Bernoulli from the great Bernoulli family. In 1735, he published a paper, an award-winning paper at the Paris Academy on the origin of the solar system. And Bernoulli went through these calculations. Bernoulli used a statistical calculation. He divided the inclination angle up into 17 bins and made the point that all of the planets fall into the first bin. So you've got 17 bins. All of them are empty except one of those bins. What are the odds? What are the chances? So Bernoulli was using a random model as his null hypothesis, to use modern terminology. You have a random model, and then you have what we observe. And he said, well, it's obviously not random. He used a calculation to show that it was millions to one that the chances of all the planets falling into this similar inclination angle. And so therefore, it must have evolved. Now, so it was a dichotomy. He was drawing a dichotomy. You have either a random design or else it evolved by natural means. Kant did not reference Bernoulli, but he did use the 17 bins. So it appears that he did read and was aware of Bernoulli. The 2 other thinkers were Buffon and Laplace. So 4 thinkers, Bernoulli, Kant, Buffon, Laplace, all using this argument, a statistical argument that what are the odds, what are the chances that the planets that the solar system would have these patterns, using the random case as their null hypothesis, again, to use modern terminology. So I want to make some observations about these 4 different thinkers and how the emergence of these cosmological evolution theories. First, they were different theories. Each of these 4 thinkers came up with different ideas of the mechanisms. How did the solar system evolve? Kant's explanation was somewhat similar to Laplace's, or I should say it the other way around. Laplace's was somewhat similar to Kant's, but still different. And Buffon's and Bernoulli's were even more different. So 4 different mechanisms, 4 different explanations for how the solar system came about. And yet all of them were completely certain that they were correct. And their certainty came from this statistical calculation that it was not random. So you can see in this philosophy of science, the work of coming up with a plausible mechanism was really relieved. It really wasn't that important because you had proven evolution to be true by this statistical calculation based on this underlying religious assumption that the world must be full, this plenitude idea. The world must be full. If God were to have created it, it would show all sorts of deviations, and so it would just kind of look like a random design. All of the space would be used without really a pattern. So this was the driver. This was the key to coming up with a successful theory or an accepted theory you could have confidence in. Whether or not the mechanism was actually plausible, well, that was another issue entirely. For Bernoulli, the mechanism was the sun's atmosphere. For Buffon, it was a comet striking the sun. For Laplace, it was a condensing nebula. All completely different mechanisms, and all of those thinkers were completely confident, 100% certain of their explanation. Their theory was right. It was the true theory of the world, said Laplace. So it's a very different philosophy of science. That's observation number 1. Number 2, these mechanisms, these explanations that these different thinkers came up with did not explain those small variations that I was talking about. Yes, the planets are in an ecliptic, but there's a few degrees of variation between them. Those mechanisms did not explain that. And so the very variation, the very evidences, these variations that proved their evolutionary theories were not even explained by their explanations, by their mechanisms. That's kind of ironic. The third point is that some of these patterns did not hold up very well. Some of the moons went in the wrong direction, some of the planets spin in the wrong direction, and so forth. But Laplace wasn't bothered by these. He still had a very strong statistical argument. Maybe it wasn't 10 billion to 1, maybe it was 9 billion to 1. It didn't impact the statistics very much. He still had a very strong argument in his view. And so you can see how, again, this philosophy of science relaxes the requirement for plausible mechanisms and explanations. You're just looking at these patterns. If these patterns exist, then you're sure you're right. The fourth point is that today's cosmology would look at this idea of random inclination angles, random orbits around the sun, as a non-starter. That actually it is considered to be an unstable situation, and you do need the planets to be in a similar plane. So after centuries of time, that whole argument has fallen apart. The fifth point to make note of is that the statistical work that Bernoulli and the others did does anticipate 20th century hypothesis testing, and in particular p-values. And p-values have turned out to be a real problem. Some journals will not accept papers using p-values. There's been plenty of warnings about using p-values. They're very problematic. They were formalized by Sir Ronald Fisher and others earlier in the 20th century. Sir Ronald Fisher, of course, is an evolutionist, so we have another evolutionist to thank for this formalization of this statistical method that was being used by these 18th century evolutionists, cosmologists. Lastly, I'll say that everything I've said about this 18th century cosmology and these theories of cosmological evolution would apply to biological evolution as well. The same sorts of ideas came to bear and be used in evolutionary theory by Darwin and later evolutionists. And I'll show you some examples of those. Let's look at Charles Darwin. Now, this was not a major argument for Darwin. Darwin had many arguments for evolution. He called his book One Long Argument, and it was many, many arguments for evolution. This plenitude thinking did play into his thinking, and he did make the argument a few times. Let me read to you an example from Darwin's Origin of Species, 1859. We never find, for instance, the bones of the arm and the forearm, or of the thigh and leg transposed. Now, this is amazing. Darwin is seriously proposing that we ought to find the forearm and the arm transposed sometimes in some species. This is the power of plenitude thinking. This is the influence of plenitude thinking. Darwin is seriously proposing a bizarre and frankly a silly idea that biology should just be randomly arranged. Biological structures, the anatomy of our bodies should just be randomly arranged. And these patterns that we see are, for Darwin, evidence for evolution. This is the exact same argument that we just saw from the cosmologists in the 18th century. You see these patterns, it's evidence for evolution. After Darwin, this plenitude thinking became even more influential and important in evolutionary thinking. Of course, we have a lot more data now. We have the powerful computers, powerful statistical techniques. All of these are being brought to bear, and there's several studies have been done in recent decades by evolutionists proving evolution to be true, beyond all shadow of a doubt. There's no question about it. The statistics are over the top, no question, overwhelming evidence. This is what these papers are saying. And how are they concluding this? It's this exact same argument, exact same logic and reasoning. You have this dichotomy, you have the random case, and you have what we actually observe. What we actually observe is not random, and therefore it must have evolved. It all goes back to this underlying plenitude, this religious doctrine of plenitude, that if God were to have created the world, you would use all of the available designs, all of the space. We don't see that in biology. We see these patterns. The bones are not transposed, as Darwin said. Therefore, evolution must be true. This is a very powerful argument for common descent and evolution. The statistics are overwhelming, but it all it entails a religious doctrine, the religious doctrine of plenitude. If God were to have created the world, he would make it as full as possible. Any patterns that we see, any gaps that we see are evidence of evolution. We don't know how the species evolved. We don't know how the genes evolved, the proteins, the genetic code, the anatomies. We don't know how the world evolved naturally, but it must have. Religion drives science, and it matters.